I would just have to be telling myself, be normal with this person.
They're my friends. I made them up in my head.
It is as plausible that you're jet lagged as that you don't like me.
Hello and welcome to the Waterstones podcast. I'm Will Rycroft, and in this week's episode we're going to be looking at meetings. Now, it may not seem like the most inspiring of words, and you might have an image of a grey office and a white flip chart in your mind, but we assure you that this is going to be a fascinating half hour or so. We'll be hearing from Waterstones Book of the Year winner Sally Rooney about her close relationship to the characters Connell and Marianne from Normal People, and why readers connect with them so much. We'll hear from Arundhati Roy about her even closer relationship to the characters in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, with both authors providing an insight into how authors meet their characters in the act of creation. And in the studio, we are joined by a writer who, through books like Blink and Outliers, has found ways of making complex research easy to digest whilst providing fresh insights on the way we live and act with one another. His latest book, Talking to Strangers, looks at how we read the behaviours and motives of people we don't know, and why it is we often get things so wrong. This is our first time meeting him, so I hope I've learnt a few things from reading the book and don't fall into those traps. Malcolm Gladwell, it is a great pleasure to have you here.
I'm delighted to be on the show.
I'm also joined by Holly. How are you doing, Holly?
I'm very well, thank you, Will. And yourself?
I'm fine, thank you. Do you remember when we first met?
I actually do.
Oh,
do you?
No. Did it go smoothly?
I think I might have actually got in trouble for it.
What happened?
We were at quite a high profile event in Oxford, and you had a very exciting numbered proof of a new book that was coming out that autumn, and you showed it to myself and a group of booksellers, and we all swarmed around you and left one of the biggest authors of all time at her signing table by herself.
I believe that was Margaret Atwood.
It was.
Oh dear.
You abandoned my fellow Canadian Margaret Atwood.
This is not a good beginning, is it?
I know. Now I'm wondering what's going to happen to me if this is a pattern.
So, Malcolm, your book, Talking to Strangers, it's a fascinating read, and I'm going to stop myself from trying to explain any of it because I know that you're going to explain it far better than I will. But you were sort of inspired to look into this by the case of Sandra Bland, weren't you? And what you look at in the book is how humans react and interact when they first meet each other and why we often get that wrong.
Yes.
Tell us more.
Yeah, I was, the Sandra Bland case was this very famous case in America that happened in 2015. It was a young woman, a young black woman who was driving through a small town in Texas, and she fails to use her turning signal and is pulled over by a police officer. And what begins as a very ordinary traffic stop turns into an argument. He pulls her from the car, he arrests her, puts her in jail. She's found hanging dead in her cell 3 days later. And you can imagine somehow this case sort of seizes the attention of the press, and it was an enormous kind of traumatic experience. And it moved me in a way I don't entirely understand why, but it did. It kind of stuck in my imagination. And it had the additional feature that the entire interaction between Sandra Bland and the police officer was recorded on his video camera in his car. And so we know exactly what happened. And from a storytelling perspective, it's an incredible opportunity it's like a real world example of miscommunication. And I had been thinking about writing a book about this problem of communication. And the minute that case happened and I saw it and was so affected by it, I thought, I should really write a book about the Sandra Bland case. But, the way that I write books is not about the thing that I start on something and then I run off in a million different directions. And so this is the frame of the book, I suppose is a better way to say it. It begins and ends with that case and trying to figure out how on earth could an ordinary interaction go awry.
You do involve all sorts of extraordinary things in there, sort of case studies, I suppose. So we look at espionage between the CIA and sort of government in Cuba. We look at those meetings with Hitler in the run-ups to the Second World War and why the people who were actually meeting him got him so wrong, and the people who actually didn't meet him but were just looking at the evidence got him far more right. They understood what was actually going on there. And you look at sort of various theories as to why we get these interactions wrong. The first of those is default to truth, which is this idea that we naturally believe that people are telling the truth when they talk to us, and it takes a huge amount of evidence for us to actually be convinced otherwise. Is that right?
Yes. So this is an idea from a man named Tim Levine, who was trying to make sense of this puzzle, which has long been at the center of a lot of psychology, which is, why are we so bad at detecting lies? Because you would think that evolution would have prepared us to be much better at that most central of tasks, but we're terrible. And his explanation is that we didn't evolve to be lie detectors. We evolved to be the opposite, to be people who always assumed we were being told the truth. And the reason is that virtually everything that's of value in human society depends on trusting others. From raising a family to having friendships to starting organizations to anything meaningful requires trust. So people who trust are the ones who got ahead in evolution. People who are paranoid are the ones who didn't. What that means is that we're pretty helpless against that very small number of people who are setting out to deceive us. So Chamberlain is helpless in the face of Hitler. And I give numerous examples in the book of people of just how tell lots of spy stories, because they're the great example, because you would think spy agencies would be the one group that doesn't fall prey to this tendency. But in fact, they do. In fact, the story, all spy stories are the same, which is the spy never gets caught for like 10 years, right? That's the crazy thing. So if even spy agencies are getting caught, what hope do the rest of us have?
This gives me hope in a way that if they can't do it, then I can't be expected to do it.
Yes.
This also leads on to this idea of transparency, which is that we expect, or we would think, that people demonstrate, for example, the emotion that they're supposed to be feeling. So you give a brilliant example of the sitcom Friends, and that if you watch it with the sound off, you can tell exactly what's happening because the actors are absolutely brilliant at signifying surprise or shock or love or whatever it might be. But that actually, that isn't what happens to a human face when it is surprised. It doesn't do that kind of eyes wide open.
Not reliably. Sometimes, but often not. In fact, I was on a Swedish television show with Mary Beard. You know yes, you must know her. And she was, who I quote, I don't know if you know, remember in my book I briefly make mention of one of her books, because she made this fascinating argument in one of her books on ancient Rome that a smile in ancient Rome doesn't mean what a smile means today. So it goes to the same point. We have this notion somehow that facial expressions are universal, that everyone, since time immemorial, everywhere in the world, when they want to tell the world they're happy, they automatically, not more than that, when they're happy, they automatically smile. Nothing you can do about it, and everyone knows what a smile means. And what we're discovering now is that that's not true. There's always been this fascinating work where people go to tribesmen in remote parts of Indonesia and show them, photographs of English people smiling and say, what emotion does this person feel? And the tribesman would say, quite apart from saying, you'd think they would say that person's happy. In fact, they don't say that. They think, sometimes they say that person is sad. Sometimes they say that person is surprised. You show a picture of a angry Westerner to a tribesman in remote Indonesia, and their likeliest interpretation is that person is afraid. They mix up anger and fear.
Right.
What we call anger, they call fear, and vice versa. Crazy. In other words, so it's a cultural thing, first of all, but more than on top of that is the fact that the three of us are talking right now. It is almost certainly the case that the three of us have different ways of displaying emotion on our faces. So if all of us had exactly the same feeling on the inside, our faces would all look different. So I cannot look at you, Will, and have the slightest clue what's going on in your heart. Right now you're laughing, but I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
It could mean you're just, it's a show. It could mean that's your way of signifying contempt for this idiotic Canadian rambling on.
He's actually crying inside.
Or he could be crying. Yeah, he could be so distressed Who knows? I mean,
Right.
maybe you know him well, so you're in a much better
Well,
position.
maybe Will doesn't even know.
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible that Will needs a few months in therapy to kind of sort this stuff out.
I don't know how this podcast took such a hard swerve to the left and became all about me.
Well,
Oh man, that's very interesting. I mean, it's funny, isn't it, that idea of with friends, and this idea of, I think, acting in general, which is that it's about demonstrating emotion often, because you have to make an audience understand what's going on.
Yeah.
But that isn't anybody
Isn't
who's
real life.
actually been surprised. If you see a video of someone being surprised, often their face does nothing. They're just stuck because they are too surprised to actually show any emotion.
But if you watch lots of television, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that your face is as reliable an indicator of your emotion as actors' faces are. And by the way, the suggestion I make in the book I talk about watching this episode of Friends with the sound off and how you can follow it along. I encourage people to do this. I actually did this recently, just double check, because I did it when I was writing the book. It's hilarious. You really don't need to listen to the sound to understand. You miss the jokes, right? But you can follow the plot 100% as effectively with the sound off.
Yeah.
It's just everything is just so kind of extravagantly enacted and perfectly represented. It's a transparent show.
Yeah.
But sadly, real life is not transparent.
It's not transparent. And one of the final things that you talk about is this idea of coupling, which I think is probably the most, not the most complicated, but I think it's the most nuanced part of the book. Could you explain a little bit about what coupling is?
Coupling is the idea that behavior is often tightly coupled to context or place or some situation. And so one of the mistakes we make with strangers is we observe their behavior in isolation and we don't take account of the situation they're in. So that first of those chapters is about the death of Sylvia Plath. And if you read literary accounts of her life and death, they always say that they paint her as a kind of doomed poet, who has succumbed to the, her destructive imaginative urges, and that it's a kind of a flip side of her genius, that she was. People who study suicide, on the other hand, would say, well, she actually was incredibly unlucky because she committed suicide by putting her head in the oven. And that was an era in British society when that was the leading cause of suicide. And it was the leading cause because it happened to be a period in 20th century England when houses were heated and stoves were lit by what was called town gas, which was gas with a lot of carbon monoxide in it. And nowadays you can't commit suicide by putting your head in the oven because we use natural gas, which doesn't have carbon monoxide. All this is a very kind of complicated, it seems totally digressive. But the great insight of suicide researchers is that suicide is coupled to a method. And the same person who might be very willing to commit a suicide one way, if deprived of that method, will not go ahead and choose another method. They only want to die using one particular technique. In other words, their behavior is coupled to something in their environment which directs and drives it. And that, so when you look at Sylvia Plath and you say, oh, she's suicidal, and you don't make reference to the fact that she had an oven which allowed her to take her own life, you miss the point. You miss the complexity of her behavior. You misunderstand how you could have prevented that suicide. And you think that she can be explained by her kind of dark and self-destructive imaginative urges, when actually it's a lot more complicated than that. And maybe she can be explained by the strangeness of this period when English homes were filled with carbon monoxide gas.
As you say, the method of suicide was there in your home. It was painless. It didn't leave your body disfigured in any way, and so therefore it was hugely popular, bizarrely. As a
commonly used, almost universally lethal, and in your house. Yeah, I mean, you might as well just put a loaded gun in people's homes. It's the last little argument in the book because I'm trying to come to a more complete explanation of this Sandra Bland story, which has elements of all those three things that we're talking about.
Yeah. It's incredibly complex, this human interaction with a police officer and a woman in her car, where something seems to come out of nothing that ends up with her being arrested. We often see these videos of people being arrested for relatively minor things, and suddenly it gets out of hand, and suddenly people are being bound and tied and restrained and all the rest of it. You obviously have learned a lot from the research and what you put into this book. Is the hope that we might learn something and therefore find a way of avoiding these confrontations that get out of hand? Or
Well, I want, I joke sometimes that I've written a self-help book that actually doesn't give you any rules or conclusions about it, how to actually help yourself. So unlike some of my earlier books, everything was tied up very neatly in a bow. This is not that book. This is a book meant to kind of complicate and mystify. And what I really want people to come away from in this book is simply the understanding that they're bad. We are bad, all bad at talking to strangers. It's not what we were evolved to do. We evolved to deal with loved ones, not outsiders. And because we're bad, we have to tread very, very carefully around people we don't know. We need to resist the impulse to judge them quickly. We need to be exceedingly humble in our estimation of how good we are at getting to the truth of another. And we need to design systems that minimize that possibility for error.
Holly, you working on the events team here at Piccadilly, huge numbers of authors coming through, huge numbers of people coming in the building to meet them. Do you feel like you have to learn how to read people quite quickly in order to make that a sort of a smooth interaction?
Yes, most certainly. And I think it's that variation between reading the author, how they're finding different elements, how the publishers and the author's team are finding the event, and also customers. It's really quick to pick up on mostly their non-verbal cues and communication of how they're feeling and how we can be doing things. But also reading that from the author is so, so important as well. Yeah. And it means that you just have to keep your eyes on the ball at all times.
Yeah. I always find it fun. Whenever I come to England, I'm inevitably exhausted. So, because you're jet lagged, you come over, you fly over, and you do numerous events in a day, and then you read some of them. And it happens 2 or 3 times every trip, where someone draws a conclusion about you that you're, unfriendly or distracted or something. And they almost never say, well, actually, he's probably just exhausted because he flew in the night before to get. They always think that there's some other kind of deeper reason. It's a kind of, but I think of it as a very fundamentally human failing that we always reach for the explanation that reflects on us. Right. We can't help but do that. If someone seems distant, what am I doing do they not like me? Are they, as opposed to, maybe it has nothing to do with you. Maybe they were up all night, they have a child that was screaming or maybe they were on a plane and couldn't sleep, or maybe they have a cold. I mean, there's any number of reasons, but those are never our first ones. And I always think, one thing, if I had to give people advice in this book, I suppose I would say that when we consider the behavior of a stranger, we should, before we jump to a conclusion, sort of make a long mental list of every conceivable explanation and entertain the fact that every one of those possible explanations is equally plausible. It is as plausible that you're jet lagged as that you don't like me.
I actually saw a picture on Twitter earlier, which is the perfect illustration of this, and it's a line of about 20 people stood at a bus stop who all look very normal but are all kind of looking down at the floor, and above every single person the illustrator has written a justification as to why they're looking like that, like was up with baby during the night, has just got pregnant through second round of IVF, or is stressed at work. And it was, I think, pairs that, it's just perfect. And it really makes you think, actually, you sat over there, what are you okay? What are you thinking?
Yeah,
there is so much to it.
Well, having mentioned authors at events, we're going to hear from an author at one of our events now. We're going to move into the realms of fiction, and this is one of the most common questions asked of authors at events at Waterstones, is how they actually come to create their characters. What is the alchemy by which a writer can create an entirely made-up person but make readers care so deeply about them that we turn those pages in trepidation or finish a book with tears in our eyes? One of the reasons for the success of Sally Rooney's Normal People, named as Waterstones' Book of the Year in 2018, was the emotional connection many readers felt to its two main protagonists, Marianne and Connell. When the book was first published, she spoke at our shop in Leeds about the strangeness of feeling so close to people who don't exist.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always interesting for me because I definitely feel I'm not one of those writers who thinks of my characters as being like symbols or ciphers for anything, or I really think of them as actual people. Whether or not I've done justice to that in the book, it's obviously not for me to say, but I really feel like that is what they are to me. And so when I hear people discussing them, I feel like, yeah, it's like we're talking about someone who we both know, except I know them particularly well. So yeah, it's funny, like I do have that and I think it's probably intellectually not a very sophisticated way of thinking about what I do as a novelist. Like I feel I probably should have moved beyond that and like have some kind of understanding of like what a character is in the mechanism of the text or something. But instead I'm like, they're my friends. I made them up in my head. Yeah, I don't know. So that's like, so when you talk about them in that way, that's completely second nature to me because that's how I think of them. What I do find hard is when people sort of like, and this actually, well, obviously this book's only really been out for like 10 days or something. But with the first book, I did have people like diagnosing the characters with like particular personality disorders or that they felt they had. And I was kind of, and it's weird. I try not to be defensive when people say, I hated your characters, I thought they were all awful people. That's absolutely fine and a very legitimate response to the book or books. But diagnosing characters with disorders and stuff, I felt strange because it goes back to what you're saying about pathologizing behaviors that I ultimately feel are normal. You know what I mean? I do. And I think that a certain level of alienation and isolation and feeling like not part of the great human community is actually normal, even though it seems on its face to be a very abnormal feeling because it's a feeling of rejection and alienation. It's something that so many people experience that it is normal. And although you say obviously Marianne, the protagonist in this book, has a home life that is in many ways not normal because she experiences kind of, she has a traumatic upbringing. And the presence of that trauma is still very much there in her home life when we meet her. Even that is something that sadly is actually quite normal. A lot of people do experience trauma in their early lives, in their adolescence. So it's just trying to be, I guess, yeah, there's something about like, reclaiming is like a bad word to use in this context, but it is almost like all the things that we experience are more or less kind of normal because humanity is so huge, diverse and varied and complex and ambiguous, and everyone has these experiences that don't seem to be categorizable in any way. So there is something quite normal about experiencing those things, and it doesn't seem to me to be pathological to deal with it, even to deal with it very poorly. I'm like, that's normal as well. We all deal with things poorly. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, and I do feel, I guess I feel, which is dangerous, I feel slightly protective over these characters because they're so young, but like they don't exist, so that's not a good excuse. Yeah, I don't know. I guess you do feel a little bit like you don't want people. Yeah, you want to be sensitive to Marianne as a young woman who's dealing with a traumatic home life. You want to be sensitive to that because such people who have experiences like that, though obviously not identical with that, are real. And so you want to be doing justice in some way to a level of experience that in some way is representative of a real social phenomenon. Like, you know, my books aren't set on Mars. They're very much set in the world that we all collectively inhabit. And so to do justice to the fictional events that play out in my very not real characters' lives is also in some way to try and be sensitive to those things as they may play out in real people's lives. So for that reason, I do feel protective over Marianne as a young woman who's had those experiences, even though she's not real, because the experiences can be real and they're due a certain sensitivity, which I've tried to do in the book, though successfully or not, I don't know.
Oh, she's just amazing, isn't she?
She is
smart. I am now reading Normal People for the third time after somebody mentioned it to me at a party on Saturday night, and I thought, God, I've got to get back into that. It's just amazing, but I like how she talks about the interpretation of her readers of the characters. I think that's so interesting because you read a book that other people are reading, you go away and you say, well, what do you think actually is going on? What more could there be to it? But sometimes maybe it's slightly more surface level than we think.
Well, I've never known a book where so many people were so invested in those characters and had opinions about how they behaved, what should have happened, all that sort of stuff. And including myself, although I found that my opinion was often at odds to a lot of other people's. And I thought, why am I arguing with this person about these fictional people and how they've behaved in a book? And I was trying to work out why that might be. And I think it's because Sally Rooney is really brilliant at depicting the internal sort of dialogue of her characters. She knows what they're thinking and feeling. So she does that without them actually talking. And I think that's quite hard to get right, and I think she does it so brilliantly so that people do feel like they know them. But yeah, that it's extraordinary, that sort of emotional investment in people that don't exist. What do you think's going on there, Malcolm?
Well, the difference, of course, is it's low stakes. So we feel free to speculate as aggressively or irresponsibly or darkly or accurately as we wish, because the person's not real and can't hurt their feelings, and that's sort of what's so inviting about the world of fiction.
Yeah.
Not the way that it artfully resembles life, but the way that it artfully does not resemble life.
Yeah.
There, and as a result, gives you this incredible freedom to make sense of what you've heard. It also encourages you. Fiction does. This is true of both the writer and the reader, to entertain the most kind of interesting or extravagant reading of someone's motives, right? Whereas I feel like in real life, people's motives are rarely as extravagant and entertaining as we imagine them to be. It usually really is that they're just tired. They're not, right? Being tired is probably an explanation of 75% of pathology, but because it's unsatisfying to us and we're used to psychoanalyzing novels, we want to give a much more exciting explanation for why somebody is stumbling. But no, they're just tired.
Just tired. Do we think that, in fact, if people got enough sleep, life in general would just be far less dramatic?
Oh my goodness, for sure. Why are you even asking?
I don't even know why that's a question.
Cut that out immediately.
But fiction, can you imagine if fictional writers felt they had to adhere to kind of real world rules about motivation, how boring fiction would be? It just would be a bunch of underslept people apologizing constantly for the fact that they're not as sharp as they hope to be.
Do you think in fiction, such as Normal People, because the dialogue is so strong, we as readers are able to relate those characters to people we know, and therefore maybe that's why we have stronger opinions about them? So if you can compare Connell to, say, somebody that you went to school with and you were not a fan of them, do you think that therefore translates through to your reaction to them in what you're reading?
Yeah, I think so, because I think there are some fiction writers who are brilliant at describing landscape, and so you will come away from that book going, that I felt like I was in that place at that time, but not necessarily have the same connection to the characters in it. And I think that there's an emotional honesty to Sally Rooney's writing, which means that she's not scared of showing the sort of slightly dubious motivations of people, or in fact the ways in which, without even meaning to, people can ride roughshod over other people without really meaning to, because that's what life is like. That's what human interaction is like. As we've been discussing, people get people wrong. They get their motivations wrong because they don't say what they actually think or feel. So we've heard from Sally Rooney about her connection to Connell and Marianne. Our next author could be said to have an even closer relationship with her creations. Arundhati Roy won the Booker Prize for her debut, The God of Small Things, and made us wait 20 years for her next novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I asked her about how the characters from that book had made themselves known to her, and as you'll hear from this conversation, she truly has a unique relationship with her fictional creations.
Well, there wasn't exactly a when. I mean, the first thing that I wrote in the ministry was something that actually happened with me, because I was on the street in this place called Jantar Mantar, which is, a way into the book, but it's actually the nerve center of the book. It's a place where all the various protest movements in India come, and people give speeches, and people are fasting, and people are finding out about each other's struggles, and then there are all the nutters and weirdos and people who are sheltered by these movements, and then there are people like me who just are hanging around. I've spent nights there, you know, just because it's such a vital and interesting place. And suddenly this abandoned baby appeared on the pavement in the midst of all this wisdom and radical politics, and nobody knew what to do with it. And that was really the first thing I wrote. For me, that chapter, in a way, is the inversion of the ball with which War and Peace opens, you know, where all the high society of Russia come through and then you follow them. But this was low society, it's the gutter ball, you know. And but then the other characters is almost as though, for me, when I think of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness as this kind of big city, and I'm wandering through, I don't even know exactly what its form is, but I know I'm in it. And then you pass by and you catch someone's eye, and then you see them again somewhere, and then they, you know, you begin to form a relationship with them, and then they visit you, and then they come and move in with you. And I actually feel very much as though they are my consigliere now, you know. And when I was writing, especially in the last few years, it was as though I live on my own and they were living with me, and I've spent more time with them than I have spent with any real, or what people think of as real human beings. To me, they are more real than real people. And they actually, I would really have this sense of, you know, if somebody came to see me, I wondered whether, you know, they were aware that there were many people sitting around the table, you know, and I would just have to be telling myself, be normal with this person. And the minute that person left, it would be, everyone had an opinion about them and, you know, what they thought of them. And even now I feel that, you know, when a book comes out, a novel comes out, and they have the people in the Jannat guest house, Anjum and all of them have sort of made me that person who has to put our boat in the water. And especially the first year when a book comes out, you know, you have to go through that moment when everybody has an opinion about the book, and good or bad. And I keep thinking, but I wonder if those people know that everyone in the book has an opinion about them. You know, it's like, of course they do.
Yeah, but that sounds to me like quite a cacophony of voices that you're dealing with all the time.
It's never a cacophony, because there's a camaraderie, there is a deep understanding. It's not like yakking or yapping, or it's not like everyone has to talk at once, but there's something very it's really like the people of God of Small Things, me, my stray dogs who live with me, all of us live in the Jannat guest house. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you live alone, and it seems to me that these characters are providing you with company, with almost as if you are, as you say, almost as if those people are in the house with you. Has it always been that way, whether you were living with people or not, that you've always had that close relationship?
Well, you know, obviously, when I was, I mean, it's only been like about 10 years that I've been actually working on the ministry. But before that, you know, one of the reasons that I do live alone is because the way my life is, you know. I keep thinking if someone were to put a camera up in where we all eat and sit and talk, it would be an amazing film, because you know, it's like the Jamaat-e-Islami is coming, the Maoists are going, the whatever, it's a complete, you know. And so I don't want to put anybody else through the slight dangers of this kind of thing. I mean, just now as I was coming, I saw that you know, some more people that I know have been arrested, and it's a strange world that in a way it's like Jannat guest house, you know, the borders between the underworld, the overworld, the living, the dead, the men, the women, the animals and humans are all porous.
Yeah.
You know, and it's hard for me, and it would be hard for anyone who lived with me to deal with this all the time.
So, as I was saying, it seems to me like a much closer relationship there with Arundhati and her creations, so much so that she talks with them, she consults with them, and she takes on board what they say in relation to how her books are published, what the cover looks like, and things like that. It's quite an extraordinary thing to hear, isn't it, Malcolm?
And they live on.
Yeah.
When she said, when people say they have all these opinions of the characters in a book, and then she says, of course they have opinions of you too. Yeah. So they're interacting with the readers. I mean, it is kind of extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's a hyper imagination that she has. Like, you know, it's kind of lovely.
I love that idea. She said that it was a bit like walking through a cityscape, and that she would see somebody and then she'd see them again, and that's how she would discover who this person was, just through the sort of small interactions that would obviously get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it seems to me that that's a brilliant metaphor for how writers often will create character, which is that they will slowly discover that voice, find out more about them, and allow them.
Do you think that explains why she takes so much time between books? Is that process much slower, having the voices inside your house and chatting with them? And
yeah, I think she's obviously, as she was hinting towards the end there, she's hugely involved in politics and has written a lot of non-fiction. So I think as well, having written a debut novel that was so successful that maybe there isn't that sort of pressure to be a book a year author, you know, she can take her time to craft something. But no, I think you're right. I think if you are walking through an imagined landscape and meeting people, and that's how you're creating a book, that seems like that would take longer. But the results are there. I mean, the book filled with empathy and love and understanding. So fascinating stuff. It's time now to hear from our booksellers with their reading recommendations based on this theme of meetings. As we've seen, it's a word that's very open to interpretation, so I can't wait to hear what they will say.
Hi, I'm Martha from Sheffield, and the book I'd like to recommend on the theme of meetings is 1913 by Florian Illies. An account of the world on the cusp of war, it amounts to an incredible meeting of minds in a final, exuberant burst before everything changed.
Hi, I'm Katrina from Glasgow. My recommendation on the topic of meetings is The Psychopath Test by John Ronson. Whilst I hope that you don't ever meet a psychopath, John Ronson meets plenty of them, and it's really funny. It's like having your best friend in your pocket telling you these stories, and it means you can't really look at people the same way again.
Hi, I'm Emily from Barnsley, and on the theme of meetings, I would recommend Just Kids by Patti Smith, who met Robert Mapplethorpe by chance in 1967 and ended up being lovers and friends for the rest of Robert's life. It's a wonderful memoir of their love affair, of 1970s New York, of Patti and Robert's artistic careers. It's beautifully written, and it's just fantastic.
So there we go. Malcolm, thank you so much for meeting with us today. Talking to Strangers is a fascinating read. I hope you found it equally fascinating to enter the realms of fiction as part of this podcast.
Oh yes, I thought it was marvellous.
I'm going to work on A, getting more sleep so that my interactions with people are less dramatic, and I suppose B, not worrying too much about getting it wrong if you meet people, because it's a hugely complicated endeavour. I hope we've got away with it today though, Malcolm.
I think you did.
Okay, that's good. Next week, it's the final episode of Season 2, and we will be gorging with gourmand Jay Rayner, Knight of the Realm Michael Palin, and debut novelist Lara Williams on the topic of eating. Bring your ears and an appetite. And if you want to suggest a theme for us to cover in Season 3, then email us on social@waterstones.com. Until next week, it's goodbye from all of us. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Abba?